Welcome to today's program titled Russia's Invasion of Ukraine Navigating the Business Challenges and Legal Implications. Session 1 Employers Exiting Russia Beyond Sanctions and Public Opinion. At this time, all participants are in listen only mode. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the text box on your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, the attendance verification code will be read during the presentation that will be required on the CLE attendance affirmation form. Please write this code down. It will not be reread. It is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Leon Rodriguez. Leon, you may begin.
Good afternoon and welcome to what will be the first in a series of webinars given by Seyfarth Shaw talking about the implications for US and global businesses of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the resulting movement of businesses and workers out of both Russia and Ukraine. My name is Leon Rodriguez. I am a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Seyfarth Shaw, specializing, among other things, in business immigration. And I am joined today by my two esteemed partners in New York, Dan Waldman and Marjorie Culver, both members of Seyfarth's International Employment Law Department. Today we're going to be talking about the process of both businesses and workers leaving Russia in particular, and then the ability of those both branches in Russia and also those workers to relocate in other countries, including the United States and Canada, but also throughout the world. I'm going to start this afternoon by talking a little bit about the immigration issues that will be faced as individuals and companies consider relocation for employment purposes to other parts of the world. This is a time when I can share with you that I am the former director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services here in the U.S. And have certainly in that capacity dealt with similar migration crises from other parts of the world. With respect to immigration to the United States, Russians seeking to exit, and of course also Ukrainians seeking to exit their countries and come elsewhere, basically can fall into two basic categories. The first are family-based immigrants. Those are individuals who have immediate family members, whether it's children, spouses, parents, in some cases brothers and sisters, in the U.S. and who are willing to petition on their behalf in order for them to be able to leave either Russia or Ukraine and immigrate on a permanent basis to the United States. The one challenge with those petitions is, of course, that they take a long time. The Department of Homeland Security is experiencing significant processing delays. There is one other alternative which will be available to at least some people. And that is the ability to come to the U.S. purely as a visitor on a temporary basis. And that's something that can be done for a period of up to 6 months at a time. Some individuals who do that may be able to, particularly Ukrainians, may be able to claim asylum in the United States. However, the initial obstacle that they will encounter is resistance from both State Department and border officials who are instructed to deny such visas or deny entry under such visas to individuals who they perceive intend to remain in the United States on a permanent basis rather than to their home country. There are also options in the United States for business immigration, either under high-skilled immigration categories or other employment-based categories, or as transferees from one branch of a country, one branch of a country to another one located here in the U.S. And there are going to talk in a second about similar options available in other countries. That's probably among the fastest ways to move employees from one country to another. Just giving the example of the US, typically an employee who applies for such an intra-company transfer visa in one country can usually expect to be processed within about 13 to 16 weeks in order to go to the US. In the case of Ukraine, I will share that there is some advocacy going on to permit people to apply from third countries. In other words, not their country of nationality and residence, but from some third country where they may happen to find themselves as a result of the crisis in order to be able to get to the US by that path. In addition, for Ukrainians, there are humanitarian admission options, either under something called temporary protected status, which is available to Ukrainians who are here already in the US or here as and who find themselves unable to return to their home country, or admission to the US as refugees. That program has not yet gone into effect, but we anticipate an announcement of the procedures for refugee admission to the United States for Ukrainians very shortly. Under that program, up to 100,000 Ukrainians can be admitted to the US. Needless to say, at this point, that is not an option that will generally be available to Russians who are seeking to enter the US. Canada has a very similar structure to the one that I just described for entry there, both options for high-skilled, general options for high-skilled immigrants, as well as intra-company options for employees, and also very similar family-based options. In addition, Canada has implemented a mechanism called Canada-Ukraine Authorization for Emergency Travel. And that will permit Ukrainians, nobody else, but Ukrainians who are fleeing the invasion and the hostilities occurring in their home country to enter, work, study, and stay in Canada for a period of up to three years. In addition, there are a number of other categories that are potential, other places that are potential options for Ukrainians and Russians throughout the world. Note that there will often be a mismatch between countries that are easy to get into and countries that are places that have work authorization available. So what I'm going to focus on right now primarily is countries that are easy to get into. Two particular ones that have risen to the top of our discussions here at Seyfarth are the United Arab Emirates and also Turkey. Both of them offer relatively easy entry. They do not have any bans or restrictions at this time on Russian flights or Russian nationals entry. One thing to note, of course, to state the obvious, these things are all subject to change as this crisis progresses. But right now, that is an option. Employees who seek to enter the United Arab Emirates, for example, Dubai, can do so as sponsored employees. There are rules, interesting rules that are kind of specific to Dubai about the necessary footprint that a Dubai-based employer needs to have. In other words, literally the number of square feet they need to have for that employee to be able to work in the country. There are a number of other requirements for employment, I think some of which you may hear from either Dan and or Marjorie as we go on. Similarly, Turkey, Russian nationals can enter Turkey visa-free for up to 60 days. There are also work permit options available for Russian nationals there. One of the things that is unique and important about Turkey is the fact that those work permit applications can be submitted after the foreign national arrives in Turkey. So it's not necessarily the case that they have to apply when they're there in their own country, which means that people who, for whatever combination of reasons, need to leave are able to do so quickly and then seek work authorization while they're in country. There are a number of other options throughout the EU. Those of you who are already deep into this will have heard a lot of talk about the blue card work authorization. There are varying requirements, but generally entry for Russians throughout the EU currently remains unrestricted. And I will defer otherwise to Marjorie and Dan as to specific work authorization requirements. I will also note that Mexico has turned out to be a significant destination country for persons whose ultimate destination, intended destination, is either the US or Canada. So I think you are going to be hearing more about Mexico as time goes on. With that, I want to turn over to Marjorie and Dan. And I wanted to talk about this. You know, we're seeing in the media every day that more companies are exiting Russia. What does that mean? You know, we're lawyers, so every word has 10 meanings. So what does exiting mean in this context? What does it look like?
Well, thanks very much, Leon. I think we all see in the media that companies are exiting Russia. But we're seeing words being thrown around like suspend, pause, cease operations, like, decrease investment and so on. And the fact is that these terms all mean something actually very different. And I'm guessing that many of the people on this call may be familiar with a list published by a group of Yale professors and researchers that identifies Western companies with a presence in Russia. And it's basically a graded list from A to F about where companies fall in terms of how they're exiting Russia. And basically an A grade means they've exited Russia in such a way that it supports the United States' objectives on sanctions. The only problem with that Yale list is that it puts in the A category companies that are ceasing to do business altogether and leaving Russia. And I suppose that makes sense. The second layer down, though, is referred to as suspensions. And many of us hear suspensions in the media about many companies suspending operations in Russia. But what suspending operations in fact means is not what you probably think it means. Suspending operations means ceasing trading. It doesn't mean, though, that the companies that have suspended operations are stopping paying their employees. It doesn't mean that they're stopping payment on their leases, utilities, other obligations. And in fact, these companies are continuing to fulfill all of their legal and contractual obligations. The only thing they're not doing is receiving revenue from actually trading in Russia. So if the object of the sanctions is really to stop money flowing into Russia, then these suspension companies that are it isn't exactly achieving, I think, what this group of Yale professors and researchers think. And from there on down the list, you have scaling back. They consider scaling back meaning just reducing operations. Their D grade goes to buying time. And then F goes to companies that are defying demands. Now, I don't know what demands they're referring to there. Perhaps it's sort of the public outcry about doing business with Russia right now. I'm not sure about that. But most companies are still saddled with contractual and other legal obligations. And so it's not just simply a matter of taking an ethical position and saying we're going to exit Russia immediately because we disagree with what they're doing in Ukraine. And Marjorie, did you have something that you wanted to talk about with respect to suspensions? I'm sorry.
I think that one of the difficulties in, suspension versus exit is definitely what Dan referred to, which is the difficulty of terminating employees in Russia. The reason why I think we see in the news suspension, but everyone's continuing to pay their employees, is because of the difficulty of paying employees. And I think it's worth noting, in particular in Russia, the role of what we'll refer to as the general director or managing director of a company in Russia. It's a position it has statutory responsibilities and obligations. It's not just what the bylaws have for their leadership in the company, the person who runs the company. There are statutory obligations. And I think in this situation, and why you're seeing a lot of companies talk about exit, but really they're still there, is because your general director has a statutory obligation. If they knew or should have known of a situation where the company cannot meet its obligations, financial obligations, they are required to declare insolvency within 30 days of knowing of that circumstance. So, when does this happen, right? If you're not getting money in and you see you only have 3 months left of payroll, that might be a trigger. If you see that your affiliates and your the source of your product isn't coming in, you might be concerned about meeting your obligations. So this role of the statutory general director is an important aspect of this exit suspension decision, because the bottom line is you need them to be on board. They are also necessary. In addition to having the statutory obligations, very little can get done without their sign-off. And it's a very formal environment there. Everything, when it comes to employees, requires the wet signature of the general director, or maybe a power of attorney. But they are very instrumental in implementing any plan with regard to employees, whether it's putting them on limited time work or making a redundancy. You need that general director to be there and take those actions for you. So they're in a precarious situation when they hear, their parent company say, we've got to reduce all our headcount, and they know they have the statutory obligation that could get them in trouble if they don't fulfill it. They could have personal liability, criminal liability. So they're in a very precarious situation when they hear that their parent company wants to shut down the operation in Russia. And really, you can't do it without that general director being involved.
Well, Marjorie, could clients appoint a general director of a Russian entity outside of Russia?
You can. It is easier if that person is of Russian nationality, but you can still appoint someone else. There's a process. I think that one of the practicalities, let's say you're going to terminate, 50 employees in Russia. There's a lot of documentation that goes along with that. So you have, maybe 400 documents. You have to have 2 copies of each. You have to have 2 copies of the termination order, the separation documents, all for everybody. And you have that signed outside, Russia. That's fine. How do you get all those documents in Russia and know that they're going to arrive on time for the operation? I think it does put some practical limitations on what you're trying to do. So just another reason that we haven't heard about when companies exit. You also haven't heard about large reductions in force or mass dismissals. Russia is very protective when it comes to employees, particularly termination. There are very limited grounds you can terminate an employee. Liquidation happens to be one of them. But short of that, very difficult to justify a redundancy. So if an employer wants to unilaterally terminate employees, there are a lot of formalities to jump through. There's notification to the government, which has a certain notice period in advance of rolling these individuals off the payroll, but you have to justify a redundancy. And it's really hard even under the best of times to justify a redundancy. And, I suspect that a court that sees that a foreign company has dismissed employees because they no longer have business due to these sanctions and restrictions outside the country, I don't think a Russian judge is going to make that legitimate. I think there are political realities that we have to face that they're not going to make that a legitimate redundancy. So you're going to be, if you're an employer there, you're going to have potentially a reinstatement order. Well, how do you reinstate someone if you don't have any business? Or in damages. And that's a judgment, it's a debt, and the minute that the company can't meet that debt, that's, again, the road to insolvency that the general director is going to have to, pull the trigger on. So I think there are a lot of challenges, and that's why right now we see a lot of suspension of business, but I think companies are grappling with what is the way we're going to execute our strategy to truly exit Russia, if that's what they're going to.
Well, and that I think the risks beyond the risks to the general directors, there are there are a number of other risks. Excuse me. One of the other things that's been talked about quite a lot is nationalizing the property of companies that leave Russia. And I know most of us have heard in the media of some high-profile examples. But it is happening. Right now, there is $10 billion US dollars in aircraft sitting in Russia that belong to lessors outside of Russia. And the Russian government last week just directed its airlines to re-register those aircraft under a Russian registry, which is not allowed under international law. It's basically just like taking the deed to someone's house, scratching out their name, putting your name, and just trying to file it somewhere. And that's exactly what's happening. We've seen the nationalization of IP, intellectual property. One example of that is the McDonald's logo has been registered in Russia for a new chain called Uncle Vanya's, where they've taken the McDonald's golden arch and turned it on its side. And somehow this is the new symbol of Uncle Vanya's. And of course, this wouldn't happen if it wasn't possible for the Russian government to appropriate companies' intellectual property. And the Russian government's also taking assets of businesses beyond just airplanes. There has been talk about taking over and running actual businesses, including, for example, recently there was a seizure of many millions of dollars of Swiss watches from a boutique in Moscow. And on one hand, it's consistent with what Russia has said, but there's also a bit of perhaps a political message there, and that is perhaps the Russians would have liked to have seen Switzerland remain neutral in this matter, and they didn't. So now Audemars Piguet is now out many millions of dollars and hopefully insured watches.
Dan, I have a question about all this.
Sure.
Are there specific directives that the Russian government has announced that are resulting in these actions, or are these things that are happening under other authorities more or less out of the blue and you don't know when they're going to happen?
Well, they're in a political regime where, presidential decree has the force of law. So there is one person that really can decide what happens there for the most part. They do put legislation around some of this. So right now there's a pending bill that does allow the government to come and seize a business when certain business events have happened. One of the triggers is potentially reducing 1/3 of the workforce. Not meeting customer obligations. There's kind of a long list. It has not been passed by the legislature. But what we are hearing is that certain authorities are paying visits to companies who have paused their activities or suspended their activities, and come in and threaten to take over, whether or not that legislation is in effect. So I think if certain actors want to make examples of high-profile companies, they will.
Thank you. So what's next?
Well, I think one, in addition to seeing whether or not this law that's being that Marjorie just mentioned, whether that gets passed or not, I think every few days there's some new law and some new decree, and our best sense on this is just to assume the worst, because there's no certainty, there's no possibility I shouldn't say there's no possibility, there's practically no possibility in a real sense for an American company to go into a Russian court right now and try to fight the actions of the government here. So I think the only thing we can do as we wait and see what happens is just to be cautious.
I think there's a time limit on how long a company is going to allow its Russian affiliate to not earn money and to have to float them the cash to make payroll and meet their other obligations. There will be a time limit there if there's no revenue generated, and there will be a decision on taking the chances of terminating the employees or declaring insolvency or whatever your options are there. I don't think companies are quite there yet. They're trying to see what's going to happen and if they can continue to still get money into Russia. But at some point, if this is prolonged, I think that's the next decision. There's just only so long you can keep that affiliate afloat. I think that's what we're going to see next. And just Leon, quickly to your point, as far as people leaving Russia, and maybe managing the business from outside of Russia, there is a desire among a certain part of the population to leave Russia. Can we work remotely and still work for the Russian company? All of that has compliance issues. There are corporate tax issues, work authorization issues. Some countries have employee leasing laws where if you're going to work in Turkey and you're going to get the work authorization to work in Turkey, you need to do the work of the Turkish company that you're working for. You can't just be placed there and do the work of an affiliate or another company. So, there are restrictions on even sort of normal transfers for employees, but I think we are going to see that happen in Russia. There are employees who are going to go and leave if they have the opportunity.
Let me jump in and share our CLE code, which is S as in Seyfarth, S as in Shaw, 6328. Again, SS 6328. I also want to share that this will be the first of a series of these briefings on legal issues that employers will face in connection with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We're going to be talking about cybersecurity issues, business risk, insurance issues, a number of other issues that businesses will be facing. So I would invite everyone to stay tuned. Also, the chat box is open for those who want to submit questions, and we will seek to respond to those after the webinar. Dan, Marjorie, any last words before we wrap up our discussion today?
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And then the last thing I'd like to say is I think if you've learned one thing from this last half hour is that this is a difficult and quickly changing situation where often the rules of the road are not explicit. and therefore it takes a lot of care and a lot of planning in order to be able to address the potential consequences of the crisis. We're certainly going to make it a point to be right by your side, sharing as much information as we can about how to manage through this obviously very unusual and difficult situation. And with that, I will wish everyone a great day here in the US and look forward to seeing you all again.